A while back, I made a video on the Monogatari series, and in that video, I talked about how one of the prevailing themes of the franchise is this idea that people need to be willing to help themselves. That others might be able to support you, but in the end, the only way to solve your problems is to face them yourself and grow past them on your own terms with your own strength. And if you happen to watch that video, well, first of all, thank you, and second, you may have noticed that a certain character was notably absent from it. That character being series protagonist Koyomi Araragi. And it's not that I don't think Araragi is an interesting character or relevant to those themes I discussed in that particular video. Rather, I think they're so relevant to him that I figured they warranted a full video onto themselves. He's someone that, the more you think about him, the more interesting he ends up becoming. Oftentimes a bit player in arcs about the people surrounding him, Araragi is the focal point where we see everything happen from and the one we're always rooting for. He's someone who's noble, kind, and fun as all hell, but he's also an incredibly layered man. Someone far more complicated than he ever lets on, and as the series goes on, he ends up quite possibly being one of the most developed characters in it. So my goals with this video are twofold. One, I want to break down the elements that make up Araragi's character, and two, explain how the series tells an intricate and powerful story with that character. So, with that in mind, let's all kick back, relax, and take a nice long look at Koyomi Araragi. Looking at Araragi over the course of the series, you can generally break down anything he says and does into some aspect of 4 key personality traits. His incredibly strong sense of justice and need to do the right thing, the kind, caring nature of his that has him go out of his way helping people, his more thoughtful, melancholic side that you see when he's alone, and the fact that he's kind of an energetic idiot. And to start, I want to take a look at that first one. Turn on any random episode of Monogatari and there's a very good chance you'll find some scene of Araragi throwing himself headfirst into a dangerous situation and being unwilling to accept any outcome where everyone isn't 100% happy, a trait he happens to share with his 2 sisters. While we don't know too much about their family life, what we do know is their parents are both police officers, and it's pretty clear that this has had a strong influence on all of their kids, all of whom have this same strong sense of morality guiding them wherever they go. Although Araragi's quick to make fun of his sisters and call them immature for always trying to save the world, time and again he tries to do just that. He approaches the world with the much more cynical perspective of a teenager, but in the end he's got the same ideals they do and the same will to act on them, oftentimes to Araragi's own incredible detriment. And it's this inherent selfless quality to the character that ends up drawing everyone to him and honestly makes him endearing as all hell. Yeah, he might screw up or step into something he's woefully unprepared for, but in the end, Araragi's always just a guy trying to do the right thing and help those around him however he can. He's always quick to brush off anything he accomplishes, but that honestly only adds to his charm. He's not this guy trying to be the hero and get the girl, rather he's just someone who can't ignore a problem when he sees it, and for all that he might complain, he will always be the first to offer a helping hand. Which makes his more thoughtful moments all the more interesting. In the rare moments when Araragi is alone, he tends to display a far more bitter view of the world than you'd ever guess from him, and it's here where we really get a glimpse of the man behind all the silly antics. Yes, Araragi is a goofball who will harass a little girl for a quick laugh, but he's also someone who skips Mother's Day to be alone in the park, someone who questions whether or not he deserves the friends he's made, and someone who doesn't ever accept any of the praise he gets and only ever seems to focus on his failures. When the series first starts, we see a very different side to him, a teenager who doesn't have any friends and doesn't really seem to want any. It's only when people start to force themselves into his life that Araragi starts to open up, but before that he's just so alone. We only ever get glimpses here and there, but the series likes to hint at this idea that for a long time, Araragi never really felt like he belonged anywhere. Feeling uncomfortable in his own house, where he remains awkwardly between his mature parents and his innocently naive younger sisters. And as someone who has seen the darker side of the real world one too many times, he has no interest in joining that either. As a result, Araragi lives his days for a time in this listless state, just mindlessly going from one day to the next with no goals and drive to do anything. Something you can really tell in the early arcs, where it feels like Araragi just stumbles onto these strange situations and helps out more out of obligation than anything else. Even later on, when he starts making friends and doing some real good, his world is always shaped by this disillusioned view he has about everything. For all the great things he does, he's a man who often looks back on what he does not with happiness, but with regret. There's always something he could have done better, or some problem that could have been avoided if he was just a little bit more thoughtful. Probably the best early example of this is during the Nautico snake arc, when he manages to save Nautico from a snake spirit, only for the apparition to escape and instead go after the one who summoned it. Rather than be happy he managed to save the person in front of him, Araragi instead breaks down and laments the one that he couldn't save, and even looks back over the entire thing like it was a total failure. Listening to his narrations throughout the series, you get this impression that Araragi feels like he can do nothing right, and that his life is nothing but a constant stream of failures and missed opportunities. And if you've ever suffered from any sort of depression, then this might all be starting to sound a little familiar. When you take that into consideration and look at the desperate length that Aragi's willing to go just to save people, it starts to paint a different picture. It starts to seem a lot less like he's this selfless, noble guy, and a lot more like he just doesn't care what happens to himself. His own well-being never seems to be a concern. If it means helping one last person, he will offer his life without a second thought, and that's frankly a sad thing to see happen. Yes, what he does is ultimately a good thing, but Araragi almost always goes about it in the most self-destructive way possible, offering himself time and again, and oftentimes getting horribly, brutally hurt in the process. In fact, one of the first things we ever see him do in the series is offer his life to a vampire he's never even met before. While I hesitate to call him outright suicidal, there's definitely a self-destructive element to Araragi. A part of himself that shows a, frankly, frightening disregard for his own well-being, and that he tends to put everyone else on a pedestal. He might logically argue against sacrificing himself, but at the end of the day, he just keeps doing it. Luckily, things always work out in the end, and he's regularly rewarded for it, but something in his life has just left Araragi with this apparent, intense self-loathing that he knows he shouldn't listen to, but can never seem to fully get rid of either. Despite all of his efforts to try and be alone, people can't help but gravitate towards Araragi. Luckily for him, they're the sort of people who have no problem forcing themselves into his life, and before he knows it, Araragi can look around and see that he's not alone anymore. He has basically the perfect girlfriend, caring friends who will do as much for him as he has for them, enough connections and bonds to make sure he'll never be alone again, and before he knows it, Araragi's happy. Even if there's always this voice in the back of his head making him question everything, Araragi just ignores it. He instead chooses to have fun and build his own weird, hilarious relationships with everyone. Whether it's the borderline criminal friendship he has with Hachikuji, to being the straight man to Kombaru, to even just being a good big brother. And it's those relationships that start to elevate Araragi out of this darkness and towards a much brighter future. So what we end up with is Araragi, a jaded young man content to be depressed and alone, but with a good heart, who can't help but try to fix every problem he sees and ends up making a lot of friends for it. There's definitely still that duality to his character, but he's on the path to transitioning away from this depression and more into being the overzealous goofball everyone knows him to be. It's the sort of heartwarming story that we've all heard before. The lonely, cynical character makes friends and warms up to the world again. He's someone who had some inner darkness, but he still did the right thing, and now he's rewarded for it. Except, that's not where this ends. Something you might have noticed while I've been talking about this is the fact that Araragi never really faced his problems. Rather, he just chose to not even acknowledge that he had them. And if there's one absolute truth in Monogatari, it's that ignoring a problem never solves it. It only guarantees that problem will get worse and worse until it starts endangering those around you. And this is where we finally get to Ogi Oshino. Before we proceed, I want to preface this. Up until this point, I've tried to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible, but from here on, I'm going to have to talk about some major plot points from the last arc of Owari Monogatari. If you don't want to have that stuff spoiled for you, I'd suggest turning back now. Alright? Alright. Ogi first appears partway through Monogatari's second season, and right away it's clear that something isn't quite right with her. She's this ghastly pale figure with an eerie smile who seems to know way too much and has an unnatural interest in Araragi. Before he knows it, she's appearing almost everywhere he goes, and usually with the intention of mocking him. At other times, she has this apparent obsession with making him face the most unpleasant parts of reality, such as making Araragi relive the day that made him lose his innocence in the world, or a bit later on, when she forces Araragi to face the unfortunate truth about Oikura's mother. Ogi's almost like this cloud that just exists to rain on Aragi's day and remind him about all the terrible things in the world. Anytime he thinks he's doing alright and just minding his own business, she's there, and she's there to remind him about the grim side of things. Something that Aragi's friends are quick to take notice of, and are quick to do their best to protect him from. It soon becomes painfully clear that Ogi is some kind of apparition possessing Araragi. But the question then becomes, what sort of apparition, and for what purpose? It's easy to look at Ogi and see her as a sort of malevolent, evil creature hell-bent on torturing our main character. She does, after all, seem to take an almost perverse pleasure in taunting Araragi and pushing him in all the wrong ways. In reality, though, she is still just an apparition, and while in Western culture we tend to think of ghosts or the like as these vengeful monsters, in Eastern culture, and especially Monogatari, that's not really the case at all. Apparitions in the series are less defined by good and evil and more a specific set of rules that they have to follow, such as Senjogahara's pact with the crab spirit, or the fact that Hachikuji can't help but make people lost. Keeping that in mind and considering Ogi like that, she's not really good or evil, but an entity acting with a very specific purpose. Which, when you look at Araragi closely enough and how she treats him, the purpose becomes pretty clear. If he's someone who refuses to acknowledge his personal demons, then those demons will do it for him. In the end, that's what Ogi is. She's the physical manifestation of Aragi's own pent-up negative emotions. His subconscious guilt at living the wonderful life he's had, his frustrations at the world around him, and, perhaps most crucially, all the intense feelings of depression and self-loathing that he just refuses to address. Everything within Araragi that has been building up across the entire series has finally given birth to a single, twisted entity. Ogi is still ultimately her own person with her own thoughts and goals, but in the end she's also a part of Araragi, which puts everything she says and does into a whole new light. Anytime Araragi is starting to feel good about things, she's always there. She goes about trying to isolate Araragi from his friends, and when his friends catch wind, they try to keep her away from him, but in the end, all that does is force Ogi's hand. And so, she goes about systematically creating rift after rift in the bonds Araragi has formed, trying her damnedest to undo everything he feels he doesn't deserve. It becomes especially fascinating in the many scenes where Ogi and Araragi are just talking by themselves. Because rather than speaking with a pessimistic friend, in reality, Aragi's basically talking to himself. What Ogi says isn't really a unique perspective, but instead it's those dark thoughts you hear in the back of your mind. The ones that you know you shouldn't listen to, but still do, and worse yet, she kind of has a point. Everything she says may be twisted and wrong, but there's a scary logic to it that makes it difficult to ignore. It's in these moments that we see Araragi basically forced to deal with his issues for the first time, but for everything he tries to do, time and again Ogi relentlessly tears down his arguments and brings them back down to her level. He says one thing, she says another, and it goes on until Araragi can't help but admit that maybe she has a point. Rather than fight the issue, he would rather just lie down and accept it. Like most apparitions, Ogi will only really go away if Araragi himself is the one to face and overcome her. But that just seems like something that Araragi can never bring himself to do. He's too busy trying to do literally anything else to ever look inward, and so it seems like a problem that's destined to go on forever. At least, until the Ogi Dark arc. By this point in the series, Araragi and his friends have seen it all. They've all conquered multiple apparitions, solidified their bonds, and have finally realized what Ogi is. They form a plan to finally destroy her once and for all, her own existence, a contradiction that the world will not allow and will inevitably correct once the truth comes out. Araragi stands and decides he will face Ogi at long last. And so, backed by all the friends he's made, Araragi journeys to have one final face-off with his dark half. And it's here that the two, after everything that has happened, they just stand in a room and talk. No more lies, no more games, just an honest heart-to-heart between friends. It's a beautiful scene. Ogi resigned to her fate and Araragi here to put an end to her. The two go back and forth until Araragi eventually says farewell and a great darkness comes to take Ogi away. Then, in a final act of defiance, Araragi changes his mind and rushes to Ogi's side. The darkness then gets ready to swallow them both, and it is here that Araragi finally does it. After almost 100 episodes and a story years in the making, fate has finally given him a rare once-in-a-lifetime chance. A moment where Araragi's obsession with saving others and the need to battle his own inner demons are one and the same. And so, he doesn't reject Ogi. Instead, he accepts her. Not to save his friend, but to save himself. And with that, Ogi gives him the first genuine smile she's ever had in the entire series. He did it. Araragi had finally learned to love himself. In the end, it was the bonds that Araragi had made across the series that saved his and Ogi's life. But this was the moment that would finally allow him to move past everything that had been holding him back. That angsty teenager who wanted nothing to do with anyone could now sit back and just be happy. He's finally free to appreciate everything. His friends, his girlfriend, and most importantly, himself. And I think that's a powerful story that a lot of people can relate to. And to be honest, one that completely reinvigorated my love for a series that I've now spent over a quarter of my life watching. When I look at Araragi's story, I'm reminded of the troubled parts of my own life, where I didn't want to deal with anyone and the world never made any sense. Yet, if Araragi, in his world of monsters and demons, can grow and become a better person, can overcome all his own personal issues, then so could I. So, can anyone?